We know Maximilien Robespierre as the face of the terror. Cold, calculating. The man whose words sent thousands to the guillotine without a second thought. He was the embodiment of fear itself in revolutionary France. Streets ran with the blood of enemies, real and imagined, and yet his calm, unshakable presence made it seem like destiny itself had appointed him executioner of the people. But what happens when the hunter becomes the hunted? When the man who decided life and death for so many finds himself powerless, exposed, and surrounded by enemies? July 27, 1794. A day that would flip the revolution upside down. The National Convention Hall in Paris was buzzing with the energy of men who had once bowed before Robespierre, trembling at his speeches, taking dictatorial decrees as law. Today, though, the air was different. Even before he climbed the rostrum, whispers rippled through the chamber. Something was off. Something they had long feared had finally arrived. Robespierre believed himself untouchable. He believed that his friends in the Committee of Public Safety, the army of loyal Jacobins, and the terror he had instilled would protect him to the last breath. But power can be deceptive, and as he ascended to deliver the speech that would define his fate, the cracks in his armor were already visible. His hands shook slightly, his voice wavered, and the words he spoke, meant to rally support, instead revealed the paranoia and desperation that had been growing unchecked for months. In the crowd, deputies shifted nervously, eyes darting to one another. Each whispered conversation carried a dangerous weight. Could it be true? Could the man who executed thousands, who orchestrated the machinery of fear itself, be unraveling before their eyes? By the time Robespierre finished speaking, the room had transformed. Fear had flipped into opportunity. Allies hesitated, enemies stirred, and the most terrifying man in France was about to become the most hunted. This is not just a story of death. It is the story of the collapse of absolute power, of paranoia, betrayal, and the fragility of even the most feared rulers. In the next 24 hours, Robespierre would face his reckoning. He would see the revolution turn against him, and the streets of Paris would bear witness to the extraordinary reversal of fate. The executioner executed, the tyrant betrayed, and the terror finally broken. To understand Robespierre's final day, we need to go back decades, back to a France simmering with unrest, where inequality and injustice had long festered. The streets of Paris were crowded with beggars, artisans, and laborers, their voices rising in protests that few in power chose to hear. The aristocracy lived in opulent splendor, while the common people struggled to survive on scraps. Taxes were crushing, and famine whispered through the alleys of every city. It was a nation ready for upheaval, a nation that would eventually turn its fear into a weapon, and Robespierre into its scariest face. By 1789, the revolution had begun. The Estates General was convened, the Bastille stormed, and the monarchy teetered on the edge of collapse. Robespierre, a lawyer from Arras, emerged as a radical voice among the deputies, advocating for equality, justice, and the protection of the Republic from its enemies. At first, his ideals resonated. He spoke of virtue, of civic responsibility, of the moral obligation of citizens to defend liberty. The crowds adored him. His speeches, filled with fiery rhetoric and unshakable confidence, made the ordinary believe they could demand change. But change in revolutionary France was rarely peaceful. By 1792, the monarchy was abolished, and France declared itself a republic. Robespierre rose rapidly through the political ranks, joining the Committee of Public Safety, the body that would centralize power to protect the revolution. Here, he was no longer the idealist. He became the architect of fear. Enemies, both real and imagined, were hunted down. Aristocrats, priests, and even former revolutionaries who questioned his authority were guillotined. The reign of terror had begun, and it had a face: Robespierre. The city of Paris itself became a stage for this drama of control. Crowds were whipped into frenzies by the sans-culottes, street mobs who obeyed the call of the Jacobins without hesitation. Public executions became spectacles, warnings made flesh. And yet, even as fear spread, Robespierre maintained an aura of invincibility. He was meticulous, calculating, always 2 steps ahead. Those who disagreed were silenced. Those who faltered were eliminated. But power, as history shows, is never absolute. By 1794, cracks began to appear in the foundation of Robespierre's authority. The people who once feared him now watched with growing suspicion. Allies once loyal began to doubt. The same citizens who had cheered his calls for virtue and justice now whispered of tyranny, of overreach, of a man who had become the very thing he claimed to fight against. Fear, which he had wielded so effectively, was now turning back on him. Inside the National Convention, tension simmered. Deputies whispered behind closed doors, plotting to curb the committee's power. Rumors of conspiracies, of lists of enemies, of secret arrests swirled like smoke through the chamber. Robespierre, sensing the shifting tides, became more paranoid, more erratic. He accused allies of betrayal, imagined threats in every corner, and tightened his grip. The speeches, once precise and commanding, now stumbled and faltered, revealing the fear beneath the mask of control. Outside, Paris was a city on edge. The streets were alive with rumor and anticipation. Guards loyal to Robespierre patrolled the city, while spies and informants reported every suspicious movement. Shops closed early, families whispered warnings to one another, and even the most ordinary citizens felt the weight of history pressing down on them. Every glance, every whisper could be interpreted as a sign of rebellion, and Robespierre, despite all his power, could feel it. His downfall, in fact, had been brewing for weeks. Even the most devoted Jacobins were beginning to question him. Speeches delivered in his name were read with skepticism. Orders were obeyed reluctantly, sometimes ignored. The paranoia that had once protected him became a prison of his own making. Robespierre, the executioner, the tyrant, had created a system so rigid that even a hint of dissent threatened to topple it. July 27, 1794 would be the day it all came to a head. The morning light shone through the tall windows of the convention hall, illuminating the chamber that had seen countless debates, decrees, and condemnations. Robespierre entered as usual, confident but under a shadow. He believed he could control the narrative, deliver another speech to rally support, silence his critics. But the mood of the room was different. Deputies shifted in their seats, whispering to one another. Eyes that had once feared him now glimmered with daring. He did not know it yet, but the system he had created, the machinery of fear that had made him untouchable, was beginning to turn against him. Allies were ready to betray, enemies were ready to strike, and in the next 24 hours, Robespierre would experience what no man accustomed to absolute power had ever endured. The full force of the revolution he had helped shape now aimed directly at him. The stage was set, the traps were laid, and the man who had once ruled life and death in France would become its most hunted victim. The story of July 27, 1794, is not just about history. It is a lesson in power, paranoia, and the fragility of those who wield fear as a weapon. By late morning on July 27, 1794, the mood in the National Convention had shifted from tense curiosity to outright hostility. Robespierre, usually composed and commanding, stepped onto the rostrum, clutching his papers with the same deliberate precision he used to inspire dread. But today, something was off. His hands trembled slightly, his voice cracked at the first few words, and a faint pallor crept across his face. Deputies, long accustomed to his icy composure, noticed immediately. Whispers spread like wildfire through the benches. He's faltering. For 2 hours, Robespierre delivered a speech that was part warning, part confession, part disjointed ramble. He spoke of virtue, of enemies lurking in shadows, of plots against the revolution. But he did not name a single person. He could have rallied his allies, silenced dissent, or at least slowed the conspiracies brewing around him. Instead, his failure to act became a weapon in the hands of his opponents. Every deputy heard an implied threat in his words, every accusation as a personal condemnation. The fear he once inspired began to turn to anger. By late morning, the whispers became murmurs, and murmurs became open debate. Tallien, once hesitant to confront the man who had executed so many, rose to denounce Robespierre as a tyrant. Beloud-Varenne accused him of dictatorship and undermining the Republic. The chamber, once under Robespierre's control, now erupted in outrage. Deputies who had marched in his name through months of blood now found courage in the presence of a faltering leader. They saw the man they feared reduced to a figure of vulnerability. Robespierre attempted to respond, but his voice failed him. The speech that should have consolidated his power now revealed his isolation. Shouts of "Down with the tyrant!" rang through the hall. The convention, which had long obeyed his every decree, voted overwhelmingly for his arrest, along with his closest allies. Scattered cries from devoted Jacobins went unheard. The machinery of the revolution Robespierre had commanded was now moving against him. Meanwhile, outside Paris, the city was already reacting. The Commune, loyal to Robespierre and controlling the city streets, refused the arrest order. Armed units loyal to him attempted a rescue, storming government buildings to free the condemned. What should have been a swift, controlled operation spiraled into chaos. Armed confrontations erupted across the city, leaving civilians and guards alike caught in the crossfire. The very streets that had cheered his proclamations were now a battlefield, and the people of Paris, once fearful, now sensed the inevitability of change. By mid-afternoon, Robespierre and his allies were moved under guard to the Hôtel de Ville, the city hall, a fortified yet exposed position. They were surrounded by hundreds of loyal National Guardsmen, but the building itself offered no true escape. Each corridor and stairwell was both a potential refuge and a trap. Rumors of betrayal spread even among those meant to protect him. Every hour the tension escalated. Deputies prepared forces to storm the building. Loyalists reinforced barricades. The hunted had become cornered. In the shadow of Paris's cobbled streets and the echo of revolutionary chants, Robespierre faced the impossible. His enemies were patient, organized, and relentless, while his supporters were fractured and fearful. Every choice he made could be his last. And as evening fell over the city, the once unassailable master of terror realized the revolution he had orchestrated was closing in on him, ready to devour its most famous architect. By evening, the Hôtel de Ville had become a death trap. National Guardsmen loyal to him held the barricades, but the convention's forces surrounded the building, battering doors and shouting demands for surrender.
Robespierre, once the master of fear, now faced the inevitability of his fate.
Chaos erupted, shots fired, windows shattered, loyalists falling. In the frenzy, a musket ball struck him, shattering his jaw. Bloodied and disoriented, he stumbled through the halls, clutching his face before deputies seized him. The hunted had become the condemned. In a single brutal moment, the architect of terror became powerless. His reign of fear abruptly ended.